Yeah. The actual systematics of exploring a site and whether to do a few or do many and so on. We found that it was useful, obviously not to dig or collect anything for quite a number of weeks until we just been around, looked and got a feel for the field problems and so on, and started doing a bit of digging and collecting. And I found it a useful field procedure simply to, when plotting stuff which we discovered as we walked, to use three basic evaluating criteria, quite apart from the identity of the sites themselves based on typology. Shelters and open primary context floors which were sticking out of dongas and so on fell into a category of what we just call primaries or primary sites. Those surface scatters which appeared to be lying on horizontal surfaces and which didn't seem to have been subjected to too much lateral disturbance, and I think that you chaps must have had quite a number of sites. So these we just call secondaries, and then the other more obvious heavily rolled or heavily patinated, widely dispersed samples lying on slopes and all the wrong kind of situations we just call tertiaries. And we actually evaluated the worth of samples as they were found in the field. And because we were operating on a shoestring and had a personnel of one and a half, we obviously concentrated on the primaries and did what we could with the secondaries and just abandoned the rest. Were you conscious of doing this? As
yes.
You did? You assessed?
Yes. I wouldn't say that we would necessarily rate what you call primary and secondary too differently.
Yeah,
because we felt in some instances that there were opportunities to get very valuable information from sites that were apparently very tight, compact units that we could not really relate stratigraphically, but we would be able to, on basis of, we'd get the samples, scatter patterns, the internal site variabilities, this sort of data. We have a great many. In fact, it's awfully hard to walk around Nubia and Egypt without stepping on artifacts. So as I guess it is in all of Africa, but it's was one of the things that struck me and disconcerted me initially when I first started working there. All of these artifacts everywhere, and most of these localities or concentrations of things you just simply we can't do anything with them. They've been they're too much derived from some place unknown. They're impediments or something of this sort that have just been rolled around.
Fred,
yeah.
you mapped in your volume the studied sites. Really, it's a two-part question. You've mapped the volume of studied sites. Is there any more geographic data that could usefully be put on maps, if you like, the sites which were observed, but for the sorts of reasons I was discussing, were not studied in any rigorous way, but which nonetheless might extend the distribution paleogeographic indications? That's the first part of the question. The other thing I'd like to ask about, because it's a problem I've been thinking about and met recently, and that is, can you also map in your area those segments of the paleo environment at any given time for which a record would you know from when the stratigraphy geology would be missing? Because this is a fairly acute problem when you get to the older sites in East Africa. Any peculiar portions of the landscape ever preserved sediments which will have sites in them, and one is up against the business of starting to think about what may be missing. And the more cases we have where one sees one is talking about both what you have and what you haven't got together, the better we'll get at thinking about these things.
Well, the first question on the we were consciously aware of the fact that we have data that we have not published, studies that we have sites, literally hundreds, which we have some information, some collections, some instances we violated what I now consider a cardinal rule. We don't pick up unless we're preparing to study the site. But at that time, we didn't have this attitude or this operational procedure. But we did make records that sites existed there, and we have collections. We could have hazarded a guess in most instances using perhaps a concept of index fossils, which would have about what it amounted to. I've identified that this is probably a Gardenitis, it's probably a Hoffman, it's probably Cormusen, it's probably that. The real problem was that we dealt there, we published nearly 100 sites.
Yeah.
We ran out of two things, time and money. And we simply just didn't have any more time in order to codify this in some sort of an organized fashion and still do what we plan to do with the major sites. And the money to publish it. The $30,000 we spent to publish that was the limit of our resources.
Yeah, I'm very lucky to have had that. Yeah, no, I take the point. But the point about the missing components, the missing segments at any, because it certainly would be easier for the geologists and archaeologists in that area to stop and work out what segments of the landscape are not represented in the Sahaba
I think
deposits.
we did that to some extent. Dansland's map of the sediments shows, for instance, on the east bank from Wadi Halfa to Ikhtiaria that the Sahaba silts and the Bir Jer particularly are gone.
Mhm.
And this is why we have no sites of that period in that area. In fact, along the Nile, particularly northern Sudan, there are large sections like that which are just blank. And it's not because they weren't surveyed, it was just because the silts weren't there.
Yeah. It would be useful actually to have a little more information on the comprehensiveness of the survey. In some way, I'm just even if it was only a sketch map, showing the relationship of survey to studied sites to outcrops.
I think looking back again, I believe that's one of the faults in the final reports, that we did not at least put in a map which showed all of the sites we found, every single site. It would have been a very interesting thing. I think also I'd have to admit at this stage that what we call sites varied a great deal from researcher to researcher. And it was only in the last phases that we exercised enough control, administrative responsibility that we began to determine people that this is what we'll call a site, not that.
I think we have a lot of trouble in some desert areas, particularly the Negev, where literally every square foot has at least one artifact. Now,
Yeah.
where does one site end? Where does another begin? The Nabateans terraced everything, stripped the slopes, the bottoms of every single wadi, full of artifacts from all periods, particularly Middle Paleolithic. Yet none of them can be considered sites.
Yeah. Well, we had exactly this problem in trying to study the distribution of prehistoric man in the lake basin I was talking about a moment ago, and we ended up by trying to devise and operate sampling methods for just measuring obsidian densities in different parts of the basin, because the dot on map method wasn't going to work, because in fact there's one zone on 7,000 foot contour where it's simply a blanket of obsidian of varying densities around the contour, and you either black it all in as one site, or you study the variation of density up and down the ridges and along and out onto the basin floor, but there's no possibility of doing this by site dots.
We found the same kind of thing, Tony, remember, down in the Nachalson in that, when we found that Australian site, and going all the way along that black flinty stuff, I mean, it just never stops. It just goes all over, and you don't know where to quit.
However, I think there the site
Except for
can be delimited.
That one. I mean, there's a hand axe here and a hand axe there throughout the entire thing.
How much difficulty did you have delimiting individual occupations on these bigger spreads?
Generally not too much. They're what they call hamadas, and they're just screes of flint. And you may find in every square meter one artifact, but all of a sudden you will find 50 or 100 artifacts per square meter.
So it kind of fades.
Well, no, it doesn't go from 50 down to 1. You'll have 1, 1, 2, 1, and then 50. And they become fairly clear.
And then you pick up another one.
Yeah, and then the one right next to it will be 50, and there'll be a whole cluster of square meters with very high concentrations. which can be plotted very clearly as to their outline. Often, if there's a slope, as you go down the slope, that tapers off quite definitely. But all the hilltops have artifacts. I mean, everything from the Batian possibly down to Acheulean. But there are certain areas where there are clear concentrations of artifacts.
I'd like to offer a sort of plea. I really think that we ought not pick up artifacts unless we're going to study them.
Yeah, I'd like to chip in here because I'm just as guilty of this too. Truckloads of this stuff and you just never get around to it.
You just leave them there.
There's the other thing, Fred, though. If you were going to do a survey where you absolutely do not intend to excavate, and you're using the survey to determine, let's say, some version of settlement patterns, I think it might be worthwhile to kick around the idea of what do you consider to be a minimal sample, and what kind of information you think you can get out of a surface collection or a test, and what can you do with this sort of thing?
The thing I was saying is, and I've been, I've certainly done this, and I feel like it's most unfortunate. We go to a place, we pick up a sack full of rocks, and we've not collected. We ruined the thing for somebody else, and it's even though it's a surface, even if it appears to us at our perspective today that it's been disturbed and scattered around and has no. I still feel like that if we're not going to study this stuff, if we're not going to take it up systematically, leave it.
What about if you know the area is going to be destroyed or something you leave? For example, at Come Up,
Destroy it.
I was
I
doing
mean,
two kinds of salvage archaeology simultaneously. One was trying to salvage something from the bulldozers. The other was trying to reconstruct something about what Vignard had done 40 years before. So to make sense out of his collections. And although he had gathered stuff like a pack rat around the plain, nevertheless, most of the areas where he had gathered it were destroyed after 40, 30 years ago. So that it was useful for me in establishing the distribution of certain sites to have his skimpy data. It might be a handful of artifacts in some cases, but it gave me clues on where to look for my own work.
I don't mean to give the impression, Fred, that I
No one
disagree
ever
with you.
had suspected that there was a so-called Aurignacian, or Menchian, whatever you want to call it, but he hadn't one hot day running across the plain, put a handful of artifacts in his pocket.
Another problem.
I agree with your idea. In fact, I instituted that rule in Sudan in '63. But there will be instances when people will want to work with collections. And I'd like to know what people believe that they can extract from a collection, what kind of information.
And something else here, you also touched on, I think, is important in this case. Even if you know you're not going to study it, with just a little effort, you can at least collect in a way that will give you some kind of reliability index to say as to the kind of information you are getting. Is it a random sample? If not, how was it selected? That kind of thing, so that if some student in the future wants to try to do something with it, it will be possible to make meaningful inferences from it.
You
I
mean
just
not
say
a
that-
random sample, but a systematic.
Systematic.
Well, no, whether it's random or not, or whether in fact,
How do you collect a random sample?
well,
Site?
sort of,
Systematically.
no, I would collect a random sample. When I use the term random here in a way meaning that the sampling technique is devised in such a way that every artifact in the spread has an equal chance of getting picked up by the sampling device. Now, obviously, on a spread, you can't tag every artifact, but you might think in terms of, 10-centimeter grids or something. If you have, of course, a very large site, well, that would be too small. If it were just the size of this room, you might think that way. Pick a number of points on using random numbers and pick up, 30 plots of 100 square centimeters or something.
Yeah, this is semantic, but I still think systematic is a better word, because what you're doing is you build a system even if you put a random component into it, which in some way satisfies you that you're giving each artifact a fighting chance.
Yeah, well, all right, let's say systematic versus
I think this is what we did by the end. If
we didn't have time to deal with the site. Might collect 1 or 2 square meters, but everything within those square meters. In the beginning, there were some situations where tools were collected. I know the first year when I was surveying in the Botna, when there was a problem of whether a group was prehistoric or historic, nobody had made their minds up. And I remember one A group site where I was struck by the pottery, and there were small lunates. And I collected the pottery, collected the lunates, came back, and somebody asked me if there was any ground stone. And I thought, no, I don't think so. And I went back a week later, and the rock I had been sitting on to write up my notes was a large grinding stone. And it was just littered with grinding stones. I wasn't seeing them, though. I was focusing, and I think you can't get...
We're the same thing.
Is that what Garth meant by this kind of site?
My point is that really in Africa now, we're about, I think, in a lot of our knowledge of the area in archaeology, somewhere that they were in the American Southwest in early 1900s, perhaps. A lot of the data that would now be possible to obtain from southwestern sites would have been, had they not been disturbed by archaeologists, could now be sorted out, could now be available, and many of those sites, many of those localities, will be impossible. And I just mention this because today it looks like Africa's full of hand axes and artifacts, and yet maybe in 50 years from now, it's not going to be very.
Yeah, but on the other hand, this is another good reason actually for taking systematic samples.
Take systematic samples, but don't do what we were doing in the early stages. And I suspect that there are other people.
Yeah, we've all done it at times. So I have to apologize to the
So
country.
I'm increasingly conscious of the fact that it's not just this environmental problems that we're talking about now, but that we're losing our resources very, very rapidly in prehistory.
Yeah. What matters if you take a selected sample? If you strip a certain known area of everything and take it away and preserve it, this is much less serious. But if someone goes back to a site and he has half a suspicion that there used to be, for argument's sake, 10% hand axes and there's now much less than 1%, there's nothing you can do with it. You can still study the site with a bite out of it where there is nothing. But if you have a good idea that a whole class of things is missing.
It was the same kind of thing that happened in Negev with the quotes Tahunian site down in Nachal Tzin. The people have been collecting arrowheads for years and years and years and years, and that's how we knew the site was there in the first place.
The difference between the surface material, which ran 1% arrowheads in the section we worked, against the in situ material that ran 30%, is very clear.
As a point of information, and people may be interested in South Africa, there's a long-standing tradition that surface sites are a waste of time, and there are no antiquities laws adequately protecting surface sites, and there have been some hysterically funny occasions in which certain unnamed fossil hominid skulls have been removed and couldn't be retrieved because in fact it had been found on the surface. And it's only since the Orange River scheme that I anyway have realized that through playing the same tricks as Tony has done by systematically collecting everything from a lot of surface sites, comparing them against a standard typology, that these things do throw up incredibly consistent percentage frequencies, and one can then argue, of course, these can't all be mixed in inverted commas in the same proportions, and they must be valid samples. And for us, this has been quite a terrifying discovery. We now realize that these things are quite precious. We have situations rather like a Negev where you do get, one step, one artifact, and then you will run into massive clusters. There is tons of it there to be done. But it's a new discovery for us.
A rediscovery. It was good when we did that out long ago.
Yes, I don't think he was ever analysing total unselected samples.
Good. Very close.
Question anyone?
We seem to have quite a range of extremes in Africa. Some of us that are still in the poverty-stricken backwater areas of the continent find we undertake a survey and discover a site and dig it because it's there. And other of you are walking around in this embarrassment of riches. It seems that you're in an excellent position to perhaps do a little, experimentation. No, that's not the right word. Plan a kind of excavation strategy that wouldn't even be conceivable in many parts of Africa. Operating on an assumption, taking ethnographic parallels, that in fact, people in a situation like this will be in different places doing different things. If they're living on the floodplain, they're obviously going to have to be someplace else when the Nile's in flood, that sort of situation. And when they are doing different things, again, we know from ethnographic parallels, sometimes they make very different kinds of tools. Now, with the kind of control you have, would it be possible to, in your surface surveys, look for certain kinds of things that might give you a clue as to what is related to a site that you have analyzed very carefully, to determine different phases of a particular phase of occupation? Have you tried anything like that at all? You know, rather than just the opposite way around, I gather you've been doing, excavate sites that have been chosen for other reasons and then try to see how they might relate.
I think, well, we might say yes, because I think really, I think work we've done up to this time in North Nubia and in Egypt, we've been just trying to get this thing sorted out. What we have, while we've dug a lot, we've picked up a lot, we have a lot of rocks. The potentialities of this material is just now we're just now at the stage where I think we could begin to ask these kinds of questions. After all, you must remember that when we started there, they didn't know really very many Paleolithic sites that existed north of the Kamumbo. I believe that the thing that I would call a site was known that it would be existing there. And so just the mere factor of finding out how to find these things has occupied a lot of our interest and time.
I think another point might be, which we hadn't really considered, is that, you know, the Nile Valley is cultivated. Parts of it is cultivated, and I'm sure we've lost loads and loads and loads of sites, you see. I'd been informed before I ever went to Egypt that in a time, we tried, Fred and myself and Scott and David, we tried to look for at certain times sites that we thought would post-date 10,000 BC, and predate pre-dynastic sites. Did we ever find one? We know of one site.
Except in the fight.
Except, just speaking of the valley itself, we know of one site that a man in Belgium has found. Vermeers is his name, Piet Vermeers. And I had always been told that stuff had been, you know, plowed under. And by my professors, and I always said I thought they were crazy. And now here it is. We did not find the sites. The only explanation we can come up with.
Well,
I'm sure that a Nile Valley was occupied, is the point, but we don't have the sites to prove it.
Well, even some of the pre-dynastic sites that were published in the 20s and 30s have now been taken in by cultivation. This is another example.
But
of
Derry,
You can't find
as
things in
Carl
irrigation
knows,
ditches.
right, but Derry is not there any longer. Dirtassa is not there any longer. Caton Thompson put it in the 20s.
You
Carl
can't
tried
find
to
things
find it.
sectioned by irrigation ditches, which are actually silted under, as opposed to plowed under.
Mhm.
Well, right. They're taken in by canals, and then as the
And then plowed.
as the water allows the people to go farther back into the away from the Nile, then it actually is plowed in.
Right. Once they get when they started getting pumps, et cetera, and we're able to get the water out, the new canals going out, they plowed the land. The sites are gone.
And
Caton Thompson worked on sites which 20 years later, Carl visited, we all visited, they're not there any longer. We know exactly where they are, she mapped them. But
Well,
Derry
what I'm
didn't.
saying is there is no section exposed, because presumably through geologic time, some sites have been buried and other sites remain superficial and can be
One
plowed.
site that Vermeers found is an example of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's in a canal,
Mhm.
exposed in a canal site. We did miss another opportunity in Egypt that might be worth just noting for the record. They dug a lot of miles of canals, you know, and immediately after the completion of the S1 dam, or during the construction of the S1 dam, and expansion of this new lands program and so on. And there's, to my knowledge, no one, except by accident, and us on occasion, looked at these canals. And I'm afraid that was the best time. They will still be there, but then they were fresh. And now it's not so easy to go and walk around along those banks and see anything.
We had that one canal site.
But then there's another thing that I believe is a serious threat to our prehistory. The cargo oasis is being developed as a new land area, and those spring mounds are being destroyed daily. The entire area is to be leveled and irrigated by these wells. And this poses as great a threat to prehistory in some respects as the Nubian campaign, because in spite of the beautiful monograph Kate Top on the carpet, I maintain that there's a lot to be learned there.
Well, they corrected among other things.
In fact, I think Betty Fayoum might say a great deal would be correct.
I think this is a good time to pause for a coffee break here.
After coffee, could we ask Frank if he would comment on Glenn's question about facies, because he read that very interesting little discussion of this and pattern some of your data in relation to this, and I'd be very interested to know what's happened to that since you wrote the PPS paper.
Oh, you're talking about the different kinds of sites?
Yeah, sure.
Base camps and transitory.
Work that you did that's relevant to the concept of facies?
Well, we had a discussion in the PPS article of what we think may be a reasonable approximation to a settlement system for the Paleolithic, which consisted of transitory camps and butchering stations and base camps. For relatively small groups of hunters who did a fair amount of wandering through an area, hunting the goats and sheep and wild ox and onager and elk and so forth that lived both on the hills and slopes of the mountains and also on the valley floors. We have a fairly diverse environment there in contrast to what you find in Egypt, I gather. And the areas that we're dealing with are relatively restricted in that we have done most survey in places where it appears that there are caves, which excludes the vast proportion of the country. And the reason we have chosen to look in areas where there are caves is because this is where we seem to find material. And I think the only places where we have systematically found material outside of caves that pertains to the Paleolithic is in the Kermanshah Valley, where we worked with the first season that I was in Iran. When Braidwood did his survey of this valley, we found a number of scatters of flint on top of hills, which were out in the middle of a great valley plain system. These flints appeared to be Paleolithic by technology, the chipping technique, the kind of debitage and so forth. But they had essentially no tools associated with them. There were places where people had chipped flint, and it looked very much to us, from their geographic distribution, as if they may have been places where people looked at the animals that were on the valley floor below them. They camped up there, looked around, and they could see what was going on. All right, these would have been, in our terminology, transitory sites. Now, we couldn't be specific about the ages of them, except to say that they did not contain material that related to the village occupations. Therefore, we assume that they were Paleolithic. Okay, so that's one kind of site. Another kind is principally in rock shelters, where we find material that can be dated to one of our Paleolithic phases or periods, but it occurs in very low frequency. There's very little deposit and relatively few tools. And also the shelters in which these occur are quite small. We did dig one of these, which contained the butchered remains of a great many animals. And it looked as if this could be a butchering site. We also, and so we postulated that there was a series of sites which we would call butchering sites, places where people mainly had been out hunting. They butchered the animals, camped in a very small shelter briefly, and then moved on. And then there was a third class of sites, the base camps, which were large sites, caves with a lot of floor space, and where there was a long duration of occupation, a great quantity of material, and where there was a greater variety in the kind of material that we found. These, we presume, are places where people camped and lived for extended periods. Now, the reconstruction that we made is hypothetical, and in the publication we stated it as such. I will not, I think that we were wrong in at least one of our judgments about a site, that is Kunji Cave, which was excavated extensively last year and turned out to have relatively little material in it. It may have been washed out or swept out or something, in which case maybe our judgment was correct. But we identified that as a base camp, and on the basis of the test we did in it, it looked like a good possibility. But it turned out to have relatively little material in addition to what we had gotten out of the test when it was dug extensively. I would say that this idea of a settlement system here is an idea. It needs to be tested with excavations, perhaps other survey, that can examine the questions more adequately. We haven't really done much digging except of an exploratory nature. Testing, we have a stratigraphic sequence of artifacts, but we don't have the kind of data that would allow us to reconstruct individual floors, for example. We do have butchering episodes out of one site, because we can find the tools associated with a particular animal. But we don't have anything that approximates a living floor in a dwelling site. The Kunji Cave looked as if it would be an appropriate one to try this in. And John Speth from Michigan excavated it with exquisite care, but it turned out to be too badly disturbed to do anything with. And that seems to be our major problem in this region. We have a great deal of burrowing by porcupines and pitting by people who put graves in, and a whole host of things that mess things up. Now, it's easy enough to dig out a porcupine burrow, but when the porcupine burrows take up 90% of your fill, it doesn't leave you with a whole lot. So this is the kind of situation you get into, and So really, a settlement system is a gleam in our eye, but not a proven fact as far as I'm concerned.
Can I ask one follow-up question? One of the problems that obviously is exercising lots of historians is to what extent this kind of pattern finds expression in the artifacts. Many of your criteria, in fact, were not artifactual, but were contextual in the form of the size and shape
That's
of
right.
the cave and the bone and so on.
Yes. We did find a greater array of material in the roofed caves. That is, stones which had been used for grinding or pigments or something else, and certain ornaments, shells, and things of this kind seem to occur in those sites and not in the others. But here again, the evidence is rather skimpy, I'd say. I might say another thing, too, that there has been a lot written concerning the presumed population in this region. And I've seen some statements recently concerning concerning a rise in population at the end of the Paleolithic in the Zagros. I don't personally see any evidence for this, and we might consider the question in general of how one does estimate population.
Presumably there must have been some difference between the butchering sites and the way in which bone occurred on the settlement sites. Was it possible to obtain any sort of general criteria that could be used to determine, on the basis of the bone itself, that such and such a site must have been a settlement site? I mean, the same way that potsherds, for example, will get sort of broken down and comminuted, around and so on.
Well, if you have it all, if you can confidently obtain a picture of a particular floor, I think the answer probably is yes. But we haven't achieved that kind of quality of excavation.
Frank did touch on another pointer, although perhaps it's not strictly field strategy. I think it's important, and it did come up yesterday, as the possibility that one was getting population pressures affected in the Nile Valley. Just what kind of evidence do you have there for increase in population?
I'm inclined to be sympathetic to the idea that there was a population increase, but I don't think that we have a shred of archaeological evidence to indicate it. This is my point, that I just don't know what the evidence is in any case, although I have seen people confidently state that we do have such evidence. And I suppose that I've seen as many Paleolithic sites in this area as anybody else, and have a pretty good idea of what the evidence constitutes, but I don't really see it. And there's a real question here as to how we're going to estimate it, especially in view of the fact that we that there are vast areas where we do not have caves, and essentially our only evidence comes from caves. Now, people were probably living elsewhere in places where they didn't have caves. I don't know. Maybe they were, and maybe they weren't. The population density probably was extremely low in any case. I just don't know.
Can we discuss perhaps ways of seeing relative population change? I think that just to follow up the last point you made, it's obvious that we're not going to get comprehensive area population censuses or widespread area indications. Really, the best we can hope for, it seems to me, in most situations, is that in a particular situation where you have a reasonable stratigraphy, a reasonable stratigraphic control, you can see a relative changing in densities of sites and in sizes of groups involved in the sites, and I guess the best chance.
What we have, it seems to me, is an overwhelming lack of terminal Paleolithic sites. We just don't have them. On one hand, you can count the Zarzian sites that are known, I think.
Tony has them.
Yeah, we have a lot of them in the Nile. What is the evidence here?
Well, I think there are a few lines of evidence. I can't talk about Egypt, but in the Sudan, the general impression, for instance, of the Kormusino, which is the earliest, although it has large sites, the density of concentration is quite low, and you seem to have different amorphous fire pits, which would not suggest, well, which would suggest to me, since there seem to be overlapping concentrations, that these represent separate, perhaps seasonal occupations, generally along a ridge, a sandbar. The Halfan, the sites are relatively few but quite dense, but very small. You could line people up side by side, and you could only get about 12 people on most of these sites. When we hit the garden, something very different happens. There are many more garden sites. They are about the size, often, of the Kormusan sites, but the density of concentration of artifacts is enormous. Plus, the tremendous numbers of tools. It's not just waste flakes. You just have quantities and quantities of tools. Plus, this is the time when we have the Sahaba burials, which, aside from showing death by violence in a rather high percentage, show actual, at least in one case, an actual graveyard, suggesting that the people were not quite as free wandering, and that sufficient number of people were dying in the area that they could be gotten back to this graveyard. I think this is the period when we can say there is probably an increase in population. Also, in the garden, just about that time, everything else starts disappearing. When we get anything that's generally contemporaneous with the garden, it'll be in a very limited area with one or two sites like the Archenian, and it doesn't spread in any direction. I think these are all evidences that perhaps there is an increase of population at that time, but how much an increase, I wouldn't begin to guess.
And of course, in Upper Egypt anyway, the later civilian is the most frequent of any.
The civilian just disappears from our area entirely.
Around Kabambo, for example, there must be at least 10 later civilian sites for every thing that went before.
Yet they're not on the other side.
There's some around us now.
One, right?
One side.
One side.
And one by
So maybe they're afraid of the crocodiles.
This may be a period where areas were just being blocked out, and population movement was becoming stabilized.
Perhaps it's something also, such as Jim Hill and Bill Longacre have been working on it in the Southwest. Their postulate is that there was a conglomeration from single-family dwellings kinds of sites, or 10 people or something like that. In Pueblo 2 times, I think it is. We find the real Pueblo. Now their idea is climate change in one way, one of their explanations, but that's neither here nor there. So perhaps these larger garden sites with denser concentrations, even though there are more, yes, some of the, I don't know how many more. Well, what's the percentage kind of thing? What's
Considerably
5 to
more.
1.
5 to 1.
And
This
it's
any
spread
other
over a
period.
greater area along the Nile and on both sides of the river.
I think there are two factors
Expanding.
we have to keep in mind in sort of evaluating our hypothesis or our conception that there really is an increase in population. First of all, there are more of those sites preserved. Therefore, the opportunities for the preservation of the garden time, the garden occupations are much higher. Secondly, I think there's there may well have been, instead of a population increase, there may well have been a change in the character of the settlements. That is the more frequent moves, more frequent reoccupations, anything of this sort. I think there are other factors, other variables that we haven't yet got control of, that we've not been able to control, that may have influenced this, and may be true, for instance, in the civilian. This might well be the
But
reason
we
why.
have control over the geographic distribution.
Right,
The
but
total absence of Jamayan in certain areas.
this may well be because of
Closer.
Jamayan, the time the deposits representative of Jamayan are poorly preserved.
It seems to me this is one, in terms of a larger paleoanthropological context, this is really one of the most crucial importances of the Nubian data, is that even if it doesn't quite get there, it's suggestive in some ways, and I think it would be well worthwhile for you people to pull out, even if you make the argument pro and con, look at it this way, it might indicate, look at it that way, it might not, but at least pull the stuff out and put it together in relation to starting to talk and think about these questions, because obviously there are questions which increasingly are of interest to people concerned with this sort of
The
period
time
of prehistory.
factor, I think, is an important one here as well, because if you've got a lot more sites, say, with the current, well, then it can be interpreted in some other way. But if you have a limited time period, a smaller time period, if you're trying to compare what went before with later times, and more sites in relation to less time could be an indicator.
Now,
That's what exists.
There's some disagreement
Yeah, there is.
around the table of the interpretation, but I think some of us at least feel that the time duration of the garden was considerably shorter than the time duration for any of the other groups, with the exception of the Hoffman group.
There's also the strategic difference among those of us on the other side, that as to how long the deposits in which we find the garden intrusive really represent. We hold, or at least I hold, that the Sahabas, the deposits we call Sahaba, are fairly short interval of deposition. And I think Carl feels that it may have a much longer interval.
Well, it's just a matter of
Semantics,
defining
perhaps,
units.
you know.
I think your Sahaba and their Fakuri together, and possibly the Balana member at the top, are all part of our Jebel Silsa Dural. This is the confusion.
I wonder if you could just, for our notes, give us what the time span that you would give the Sahaba is.
12,000 to approximately 10,000. I have a little paper that I've given where we've taken all the radiocarbonates that I could find from the Nile, like Nubia and
That
Egypt,
would be very useful.
and tried to work these into my version of this stratigraphy with some bias, I'm afraid, to other people's points of view. But I guess we all do this one.
But you think it's a couple thousand years?
Yeah, I do think.
Carl thinks it's what?
No, I think maybe we don't have as, I think this, but my view before of his understanding was that that this was a longer span, but probably what we've done here is separate something that he had in one unit. But if we're correct that the Sahaba Silks is a 2,000-year span approximately, and if we're again correct that what we call garden is confined almost to that interval, then there either is a radical change
Who
in
said
settlement
that?
structure. I do.
Who said the garden is confined to?
I do.
That's too.
And
It may be in Egypt.
and you see, this is. I think there's a point here. We don't have school solutions to some of our problems.
Well, Fred, you've raised a large number of entirely very legitimate points against an approach, or this approach to population estimation. But the fact still remains, if we ever are going to think about this problem, it is only this kind of aerial archaeology, as you call it, or area archaeology, which is going to give us the results. And we can only view population fluctuation in terms of site number fluctuation up through time. And I doubt if we're going to find another way out of this. There are going to be little bits and pieces of evidence, such as the material which Tony suggested to us, would help along, like site size and duration of occupation where we have the evidence. But unless we get more and more studies like this where you can simply say the expectation would be that with time the chances of site survival will increase, therefore the earliest site should have very few and the youngest should have very many sites, and we would expect some sort of perfect little inverted cone in terms of numbers and then put the real data against that expectation and find out whether you do get jumps in any way.
In Egypt, in Central Egypt, again, if we took the actual number of sites, that is, use that kind of a rough estimate of population, we would have two very pronounced peaks. One of them is in this interval of earlier lower silts, which we call Quake, roughly with the Debergera and Masmas. This peak then would date somewhere, we think, and it's near the end of that period of deposition, somewhere in the range of 15 to 16,000 BC. And then there are lots of all different kinds of things, but we have a block of time in which these can fit in. And there's another peak, much like the Gaden peak that we're talking about, that occurs in Egypt at about the same time. I don't know that this is directly related, but we'll observe it as a phenomenon. At about this, in the same stratigraphic context, also it occurs at the time when grinding stones appear and where these lustrous edge pieces appear. These sites, again, are very numerous, very large, but probably do represent reoccupations of the same locality. My impression from my trying to strain at the evidence, I suspect, from the Nubian thing, was to suggest that there was a new source of energy available to these people, and that this caused a population upsurge.
Then how many sites do you have between 10,000 and, say, 4,000 BC?
We have between 10,000 and 4,000. We have one outside of the Fayum.
So you're not in a real good position there to say what happened after 10,000.
But surely you do have to make some kind of correction against area of outcrop of the sediments which could contain sites.
That's what we're
talking about. Yeah, but isn't there another problem involved? We haven't really coped with it. I don't know whether we can. That we may be dealing with seasonal occupations of these sites, and the absolute number of sites could reflect moving subsistence patterns rather than.
That's the point I raised earlier.
I think the absolute number has to be balanced against the size and density. I mean, people have to live someplace all year round. They're making
Well,
tools all
yes
year
and no.
round.
I mean, supposing you come back to the same, they don't have to live in one place all year.
No,
Seems to
they
me
have to
that our
live
sites
someplace.
show that they came back seasonally, or
Yeah,
whether
but they come back
reoccupy
time
the
and
same
time again to the
same
same
group of people.
Well, they
spot.
may. They may well.
You know, then you're dealing with the problem
But
that.
if you have 10 sites, and all of them are very large and very dense, where a group of people are just going back and forth, or you have 10 sites and they're all small with very little concentration, there is an essential difference.
Well, the problem that you come down to here is how do you isolate these factors out? I don't think we have a means of doing it yet. But
Well, is there any one single concrete fact in the archaeological data which really shows us there was seasonality in any of these sites? Why couldn't the guys just have been fed up with sitting around on all these little nasty, sharp, prickly microliths, and they just shifted a couple of steps sideways to get out of the way?
Well,
That
because
may be a point. I call that prickly feet, because some of these things.
Soft sand hypothesis.
My soft sand.
Yes.
This is where we look at the sites.
There are too many unknowns, and the archaeological data is not complete enough for us to be able to talk intelligently about seasonality yet.
because we haven't even defined the microenvironments.
Sure, yeah, well, that goes right back to day before yesterday.
Yeah.
It's interesting to note that one of the most sedentary of the American Indian groups, the Iroquois, shifted settlements every 10 years or so. They ran out of firewood, and they generally followed their nests, and so they picked up and moved. Not very far, but they moved.
or the Kung, who move every time the smell gets too bad.
Well, I think there has to be something else added to the concept of buried archaeology in order to get this problem about population changes and density change. Because while we've been trying to do this, we have not been able to resolve these questions that we've raised here.
know, this counting sites itself won't get us very far. You have to know what's going on. For example, some years ago, I was trying to draw up a demographic model for the Solutrean in France. And my first impression was that since there are about 10 lower and 30 middle and 60 upper Solutrean occupations, this shows a clear funneling, but it's not that way at all. You can very well interpret it as the final Solutrean showing a drop in population, because most of the occupations, or at least where the sites have been properly excavated, show very thin scatters, millimeters thick, one on top of the other. There's certainly some change going on in their location habits.
But it seems to me, Phil, that one of the things is the need to start marshalling the data, even if you don't come to the conclusion. You say,
Yes, it is.
having put all the stuff together with this in mind, what we've got is a non-conclusion. But unless we start doing this, we never develop the methods, we never work out ways in which the field strategy, in a sense, as you were talking about this morning, will be refined to the point where we may get over some of the difficulties. And I don't think anyone here would underestimate the difficulties. But if we ever hope to get this kind of thing, it seems that it is worth marshalling in the best existing cases, marshalling the data, even if we know before we start marshalling it that you could read it when you're finished in many different ways. But at least to go through the exercise of putting it together and seeing how it works.
I think in some specific cases, perhaps the Solutrean is a bad case to take, as it's perhaps you know too much about the Solutrean, and also we're not really very well served with surface sites. One can't really say we know every Solutrean site in France. There must be a lot of other things in
Well,
between
it
the
wouldn't
various
matter if
caves.
you knew them all. If you have a sample through time and through space, you should be able to make some judgments.
See the derivative, if not the absolute.
But you often, one of the real problems is the non-comparability of often even the most gross data from these sites. In many cases, the sites are completely finished, and in other cases, what's needed is just to go back and test, really, not much more than that, in order to clarify things that are obscure in the literature. And in fact, excavating sort of with Fred, I think, in some remarks he made earlier, extensive excavations of caves is in fact not a good idea, you could argue, for many reasons, and I may have misunderstood it, depending on the questions you ask, of course. But did I gather correctly that, Frank, that you have done mostly survey and testing?
That's correct.
Sampling, but not a lot of, big exposures and things like that.
No, there's one more thing I have to
I
point
would
out.
say it's a good idea, by the way, that you did.
One more thing I have to point out with regard to the survey, too, is that it's quite a different circumstance here to collect material from a cave or a rock shelter in western Iran than it is to collect an open site in Nubia. We are lucky to find a few pieces of material eroding out of a steep talus, and we crawl on hands and knees for a couple of hours across the surface of this thing, and we can identify the age of the site if certain characteristic artifacts come out, but we haven't the slightest way of getting any kind of a surface scatter which would be meaningful, and if we get a couple of dozen pieces, it's been a very good day indeed. So there's quite a different sort of material, of data that we get there compared to what you get in these big surface sites.
This is one reason, though, I did say that if you wanted to make a comparison between Kormusen or something like that and an analogous sort of thing somewhere else, you have to look under the right conditions for the analogy, and the northern Transvaal would be a case where there's not enough stuff on top, there's a lot of erosion. You could approach, it won't be the same, of course, you could approach conditions where you could then collect and work in a certain way, so you'd be able to make some comparisons that would be comparable, in fact. And this is the problem, I think, in most of these cases.
It might be interesting to consider what kind of evidence we would like to see that would not be ambivalent, that would be clear evidence of seasonality or clear evidence of permanent occupation. Personally, I can't think of that one is likely to see preserved in the archaeological record that's not capable of more than one or interpretation either way.
We can prove that
What
people
is-
lived in some sites during certain seasons, but we cannot prove that they did not live there during other seasons, which is the usual
That's the
problem,
problem.
right?
Let me raise another
It can become very
possibility.
improbable, like Star Khan, but,
Raise another possibility here, as regards these overlook kind of sites. And I saw similar kinds of things in South Arabia, where there'd just be on good vantage points at junctions of wadis and so forth. Sometimes very slight scatters of artifacts, sometimes fair concentrations. But if one were to take as a minimal unit, just the most minimal definition of a campsite, perhaps one day or something. I just wonder, do you anywhere find in these sediments very small scatters, so that, I'm thinking if you could find a patterning of lots of small sites, it might give you a very vague kind of control of a time, so that you could then do a rough quantitative kind of measure of larger sites as to time of occupation.
On the West Bank, across from Wadi Halfa, there is a major camel trail, historic camel trail, and you find along this trail a series of fireplaces with some stone, usually broken up quartz. The areas with the scatter will be about the size of this table. About 1 out of every 3 is associated with things that are Nubian pottery, Nubische wares, which are historic. But from generally what I can see of the camel trails, camel herds when we were there, they would stop for a day or two at Wadi Halfa and then go on. And if these camps, these little fireplaces, indicated at all the amount of garbage that was being left in that time, it was absolutely minimal.
By how many people?
Well,
6?
6,
5 or
7,
6
something like that.
Yes,
10.
but these people are not shipping
But of course,
stone.
they're not.
Right, they're
They're
not
doing
doing lots of
something.
other things.
They're doing something quite different. But
Do you find small, kind of minimal units of artifact concentrations anywhere in the sediment or in the archaeological context?
rather dense concentrations, but very small.
Yeah, just something that has delimiting features, but, not many
Oh, sure.
artifacts. Something, so
Yeah.
that, yeah, well,
But not so small that you could say it's a day or two.
right, but what I'm getting at, this does give one, if you can find a patterning of minimal units, this does give you a kind of a time unit, which might be 1 day, 1 camp period kind of thing, and you might then think in terms of these other sites as multiples of that kind of a unit. It might give you a rough kind of a chronological scale for evaluation of sites.
With the Kormusen, unfortunately, where one might have expected to find a single campsite with some artifacts, the closest we came was the earliest site, not the earliest, second, 1017, which was still a living floor where you could still put cores back together. And it was still about 100 meters long. And at least what the excavation showed up at least 3 different fire areas. Now, it couldn't have been occupied for very long. But how long?
I think it is important to realize that there are differences of many orders of magnitude between site form, and even if you can't resolve all the factors very clearly, the differences are sometimes so marked that you may be able to deal with them, even though you don't differentiate all the variables. And that's the site I was talking about earlier. Literally,